Okay, thank you, Daniel. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Celeste Beesley, who is an associate professor of political science here at Brigham Young University. She received her bachelor's degree in economics from Princeton University, and then her master's and PhD in political science from the University of California at San Diego. She works on questions of international political economy, as well as globalization and public opinion. She does a good deal of work in Eastern Europe, including post-Soviet countries. She's widely published in these areas, and she's also, for BYU, the principal investigator of the Women Stats Project, which is a very important database regarding welfare, well-being of women throughout the world. She's an insightful and engaging teacher, and we're excited to hear her speak today about a very timely topic. In fact, she was talking about how even just in the last few minutes, she might have had to adapt and change some things. But her title, of course, To Fight or to Bargain, Ukrainian Public Opinion on Prospects for Peace. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Celeste Beesley here to the Kennedy Center.
All right. As Professor Benville said, this is much more political than I intended it to be when I first proposed giving this lecture to the Kennedy Center in the fall. So obviously you're here because you may have heard that there is a war going on in Ukraine. Ukraine was invaded in February of 2022. So we're in the fourth year of the war now, just recently started the fourth year. This is the most recent map that I could find of the situation going on. And currently, Russia controls about 20% of territory that is internationally recognized as belonging to Ukraine. Now, not all of that has been conquered since 2022. Some of it was held, and so you can see here, right, Crimea, and this section of the Donbass was held by separatists or controlled by Russia since 2014. And so they have actually not captured 20% during the war. It's more about 10% that has been captured since 2022. So at the rate that they are currently advancing, Russia would have conquered all of Ukraine in about 83 years. So Ukrainians are looking at that in terms of they have some time and some space to keep working and fighting at this. Obviously, a lot of consequences of this. About 46 million Ukrainians have left, a lot of people have left the country, right? More than a third of the population has been displaced. There are a lot of refugees, some into Belarus, some into Russia, but obviously most of them have gone out through Western corridors. So millions and millions of Ukrainians have been displaced. Military casualties, these are hard because there are political incentives to not be entirely honest about what your military casualties are. We actually haven't had an official update from Russia on their military casualties in 2 years. And then they said it was 6,000. The BBC has been running this with open source estimates. And they think that with open source estimates, they're getting 45 to 65% of the casualties. And so they think overall, Russia is probably running somewhere between 167 and 234,000 military casualties. Ukraine is, the most recent report from Zelensky was 46,000 military casualties. Both the Pentagon and an open source NGO put it more at around 70,000. So that's probably a more realistic estimate. The United Nations puts civilian casualties, and that's both death and injured, at, and this is from August of 2024, at about 12,000 civilian killed and another 25,000 or so injured since the beginning of the invasion. And so that's just kind of the setup because, right, this is a very costly war. It's a costly war for Ukraine. It's a costly war for Russia, but we don't know how much the costs matter in terms of Russia thinking about how to end the war and making concessions. And so for Ukrainians, it's more openly discussed that the costs of war are part of this, the calculation on whether to bargain, because there aren't a whole lot of other options, right? Ukraine knows they're not going to be able to fight Russia to surrender. Russia has given no indication that they're going to sort of see the light and decide it was not a good idea to invade their neighbor. And so bargaining or continuing sort of a long war of attrition while they're trying to hold on to the rest of their country for the 83 years it would take the Russian army to take it at the current rate of advance. So bargaining is what we're looking at, right? And we do see that, and this is data from the Kiev International Institute of Sociology. They have been running regular polls in Ukraine, and asking this question about territorial concessions, right, which is one important part of the bargaining process that's being discussed. And you can see that since 2022, right, May 2022, they've switched from about 10% saying that Ukraine should give up some territory, while 82% is saying under no circumstances should Ukraine give up territory, to sort of the most recent poll, which ended on March 3rd of this year. 39% say that they should make territorial concessions, but it's still 50% arguing that under no circumstances those territorial concessions could be made, with about 11% refusing to answer. Looking at some of the other conditions for the bargaining that's going on here, and this is again sort of the most recent, wrapped on March 3rd poll. Again, right, we've still got a majority who think that it is probably or completely unacceptable for Ukraine to offer that they're not going to sort of integrate with the West, whether that's joining NATO or the EU, and an even larger majority thinks that it is completely unacceptable, right? 60% think it's completely unacceptable to acknowledge the occupied territories as belonging to the Russian Federation. And part of this comes with this idea about the suffering and the sacrifices in the war. And so this is an interesting question, again, from this February-March poll, and it asks which of these statements do you agree with more? We've already suffered great losses and may lose even more people, so it's worth negotiating to end the war. And that's getting about a third of the respondents, but 45% say that because we've already suffered so much, a peace that does not meet our demands is unacceptable. So when we think about the cost of war and bargaining, this is something that has been studied extensively in international relations. We know a lot about sort of U.S. foreign policy opinions across multiple wars, and that increasing costs, whether that's financial costs or human costs, lead to less support for fighting. But in some ways, the U.S. is exceptional, right? The U.S. tends to opt in and out of wars and fight wars overseas and do those kind of things. And that is not representative of the way that most of the world fights wars. And so it's not clear how the costs of war play into, this is something I'm doing research on, play into how Ukrainians think about this. And there's some indication that suffering is seen as a cost and invokes sort of a cost benefit and increases willingness to bargain. But there's also some indication that at least certain kinds of costs, that if Ukrainians have experienced certain things, that it makes them more resolved to continue fighting rather than to bargain. And so this is the results of an analysis that I'm running on some data that I collected in late 2022. I currently have a follow-up that's in the field right now, and I'm hoping, well, I don't know. I'm hoping something interesting happens while I'm collecting data, because natural experiments are fun. Anyway, but basically we just ask, do you think Ukraine should make some concessions to end the war? Not specifically territorial, but just a general question. And then looking at the costs of war and how those impacted people. And you can see that if it's on this half of the graph, they're indicating a preference for fewer concessions. And on this half of the graph, more concessions. And so people who have been displaced by the war, you think, that's a significant cost. You had to leave your home. In an open-ended question in this survey, when we asked people what their biggest frustration was since the beginning of the war, overwhelmingly the most common answer was, I just want to go home. But being displaced makes you more likely to favor fewer concessions, significantly more likely. If the bar crosses this line, it means we can't make specific statements, right? We can't make confident statements that this is having any effect. If you have a family member in the armed forces, you are also less likely to favor concessions. If you have had trouble accessing needed medicine, it makes you more likely. If you have witnessed violence against other people, it makes you more likely to support concessions. However, if you have personally been victimized by violence, if you have personally experienced violence in the war, it makes you way less likely to support this. And then if you have suffered economic harm, so this is job loss, income loss, or emotional harm, this is loss of sleep, increasing drinking, feeling depressed, those kind of things, you're more likely to be in favor of concessions. And so the Ukraine war is interesting in that respect, because while all of these things are costs, they are not supporting sort of the idea that as the costs of war increase or accumulate for people, they're going to be more willing to try and find a way to end the war, and more willing to bargain their way out of the war. It depends on what kinds of costs they're doing. And the more direct those costs are, the more they are in favor of continuing to fight. And so what does this all mean? We've got these are headlines just from the last week or so, which brings up, and there's a lot of international attention on trying to reach a bargain. The news article I had to read 10 minutes ago was that Zelensky and Trump had just finished a phone call that was a follow-up to yesterday's phone call between Trump and Putin. But news, right? These recent headlines from Wall Street Journal, BBC, is the idea that because Ukraine is democratic, it's a flawed democracy, but it's a democracy, that this isn't something that is just about the international audience, that it's also about what Ukrainians think and what they want. And so this idea, and so the big thing that has come out of all of this is, why is it that still 50% of Ukrainians don't want to give up territory? Why is it? Are they just being intransigent? What's going on here with this? And so you have to worry about the bargaining both from the international level, but also at the domestic level, right? Is this something that Ukrainians can or will accept? And that is a big input into what Zelensky is considering as he considers these different proposals and things. And so there's a couple of approaches here. And Bronislav Sanchev, who's an international relations scholar at the University of California, San Diego, he's brought up and he's proposed that that the Trump administration may be looking at this unwillingness to bargain as intransigence or sort of a moral hazard problem, that Ukraine should be more willing to bargain, but they feel artificially strong because of Western backing. And so putting that Western backing in question should force Kiev to think about, like, what would they be willing to give up, and to really think about sort of maximalist, how much should they give up? That is the approach that the current administration is taking. The other big issue that is, and we're going to look at this, that I think the data supports more strongly, is that what we're looking at is what's known as a commitment problem in international bargaining, right? If somebody breaks a contract, right? If you have a business contract, then that is going to be governed by the laws of the country where it was concluded. But in an international contract, we don't have an international government. And so what happens when someone completes a bargain or signs a treaty, signs a ceasefire, and then doesn't follow through on the terms of those conditions? And the answer is not much, unless you've built that into the bargain. And so that seems to be what we're looking at in Ukrainian public opinion, is the concern about this commitment problem. that Russia will not actually follow through with any conditions that it agrees to, and that will put them in a worse place. So this is August of 2024. And this asks and this I think is arguing in favor that it is not intransigence, right? So what do you think the political and military leaders of Ukraine should do if Western military support changes or ends? Sorry, the slide cut this off a little. Blue is continue to fight in any circumstances. Orange is try to freeze the conflict but don't make concessions. Green is make concessions. And then blue is I don't know. Which, given the uncertainty the Ukrainians live in, I think we can forgive them for being a little uncertain about how to answer this question. And you can see that in the absence of Western military support, the most popular answer is find a way to negotiate, but it's still only about a third of Ukrainians that are willing to give that answer, right? A much higher percentage overall in Ukraine, and there's some regional variation, with the East being sort of like closest to the war and the West furthest from it. But we're still talking about 45% of Ukrainians are like, find something to do other than make concessions. And so it doesn't seem that Western military aid is somehow causing this intransigence. Now, just because everything's been going on recently, just last week, right, there was an Ipsos poll commissioned by The Economist journal that asked this same question. Should Ukraine continue fighting if the United States withdraws all support? And 74% of Ukrainians now agree that, yeah, Ukraine should keep fighting even in the absence, right? Even if the U.S. withdraws support. And so there is a high level of resolve and this kind of polling data, I would argue, is not consistent with the moral hazard argument that Ukrainians are feeling too cocky or too confident in their bargaining strength because of Western aid. Instead, the public opinion seems to be in favor of the fact that the Ukrainians are very worried about credible commitment problems. And so to explain a credible commitment problem really carefully, right? So if Ukraine has to decide to keep fighting or to settle, but if they choose to settle, if they choose to make a deal, negotiate an agreement, they then have to worry whether Russia will honor the commitment or renege. And the issue that a credible commitment is that if Russia honors the commitment, then Ukraine would be better off settling than keeping fighting. But if Russia chooses to renege, then Ukraine is much better off, right? Their payoff is better if they choose to keep fighting rather than make the bargain. And so, so this is the issue that is creating so much opposition to bargaining among Ukrainians, because and why when they talk about bargaining they are insisting or wanting to insist that the bargain include certain like security guarantees, because they think those will change the probability that Russia chooses to honor its commitment rather than renege, right? By increasing the costs of reneging on the agreement through foreign backing or peacekeeping forces, security guarantees, those kind of things, that will potentially shift the probability that Russia honors its commitment. Because right now, Ukrainians are not putting a high level of probability on that, which is why they want that as part of the bargain. So this question, now they're not entirely sure that even security guarantees are going to work, which may explain some of the intransigence. So again, right, are security guarantees from other countries, is that going to protect you from future Russian aggression? And you can see that we're still running, right, for all of Ukraine down here, we are still running at almost 40% that either don't know or disagree with that statement. But they do, right, a lot more Ukrainians are comfortable with the idea that there won't be future Russian aggression in the presence of security guarantees. Again, it depends on what part of the country you're in. The lowest percentage here is in the East because they're most exposed to Russia and the war. But here, right, regardless of the terms on which you end a war, if there's a bargain, will Russia attack again in the future? 27% of Ukrainians say yes, and another third are in the probably yes camp. And so, and 26% are don't know, right? Only 4% of Ukrainians are like, no, Russia won't attack again. There won't be other problems, and 10% would probably no. And so they're very concerned about what happens after the bargain. And interestingly, right, the willingness to concede, and this is again the Kiev International Institute of Sociology poll that wrapped it in the beginning of March. So this is all sort of hot off the presses data. Whether you're willing to accept concessions depends on what you think Russia's goals are in the war. And so they ask Ukrainians, like, what do you think Russia wants out of this war? And for people who think that Russia's goal is to commit genocide of Ukrainians, right, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the majority of them are categorically opposed to concessions. These numbers don't add up to 100% because they don't show the I don't knows. If you think that they are trying to destroy Ukrainian sovereignty and nationhood and take most of the territory, again, not much difference than the genocide. If we get down to believing that that even future sort of Russian power or aggression is going to be survivable for Ukraine, right? If you think that they're just going to establish a pro-Russian government, you get almost parity here, right? You shift to more people being in favor of concessions than not. And if you think that they're only going to take sort of a chunk of the country and make no claims to others, then you get a supermajority. More than 2/3 of the people who think this is what Russia wants are willing to support concessions. And if you think that they have very minimal territorial goals, then it's 78%. The problem is that 2/3 of Ukrainians believe that these two are the goals, right? That this is about the destruction of Ukraine, either the physical destruction of the Ukrainian nation through genocide or the destruction of Ukrainian sovereignty or any sort of meaningful sovereignty to that. And so these other ones, right, I mean, people, right, 78% of the people who think that they just want to have the occupied territories are like, yeah, we should concede on that. But that's 4% of Ukrainians. And so they actually included a survey experiment in this where they randomized what conditions of a treaty or a bargain Ukrainians saw when they were answering the question, and then asked whether they would support an agreement with Russia under those circumstances. And you can see that the security guarantees and sovereignty are super important here. So interestingly, right, Russia controls all occupied territories. Russia controls all occupied territories. In both of these scenarios, the territorial concessions are exactly the same. The difference between them, which shifts you from 71% of Ukrainians being categorically against bargaining to 74% being in favor of bargaining, or at least accepting of it. The differences are the security guarantees, right? No security guarantees, and you cannot work with the EU. And then there's some kind of security guarantees. Here they include either peacekeepers or an increase in weapons aid or NATO, right? Any kind of security guarantees, promises from the West. And then the only other difference between these two that has this enormous shift in whether or not we can accept a bargain is whether or not Ukraine has political sovereignty. And so it really does appear to me in the data to be that Ukrainians are worried about the credible commitment problem, right, rather than some sort of intransigence based on aid. And so why might they be so worried about that? This is a list of Russia's broken promises. This is from an editorial put together by the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. They start with the Budapest Memorandum, which was signed in 1994 by Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and the UK. The Ukraine agreed in the Budapest Memorandum to give up their nuclear arsenal. They inherited on independence the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, and they agreed to give that up in exchange for security guarantees from the US and the UK, and Russia in particular promised to respect the economic, political, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. In 2003 was sort of the first challenge there. This was still under the Kuchma administration. Leonid Kuchma was the president of Ukraine at the time, and he was very much sort of client of the Kremlin. And even then, Russia started to just build a dam in Ukrainian territory, and the Ukrainians said, "What's up with that?" And Moscow said, "Oh, let's reach a deal." And they reached a deal that was very advantageous to Moscow and not so much to Ukraine. And then obviously in 2013, there was the planned signing of the EU accession agreement by the Ukrainian government, by Viktor Yanukovych. That he just pulled out of at the last minute. It's widely believed that that is because Putin told him that that was unacceptable. And that is what sparked the Euromaidan protests that lasted from November of 2013 until February of 2014. And I will just mention it's not warm in Kiev during that time. But they managed to keep thousands and millions of people on the street all of that time. Not really because the EU accession agreement was that important, right? If you look at polling data from 2013, there was actually a pretty even split between people who thought going to the EU versus like signing an agreement with other post-Soviet countries was a good idea. But the idea that Moscow controlled what treaties Ukraine could sign and the idea that the Ukrainian government would turn violent on protesters, that's what really drove those protests. In 2014, obviously, that's when the war really started, right? The 2022 was not the start of this war, but Russia annexed Crimea, sponsored a separatist war in the Donbass, and there were a number of ceasefires, right, that Ukraine agreed to with this. The Minsk I ceasefire in 2014, the Minsk II ceasefire in 2015. That one was especially fun because right after negotiating it, Russia claimed that it wasn't a party to the ceasefire agreement, that it was between Ukraine and the Donbass separatists, and so they were still at liberty to be sending a bunch of military hardware and being aggressive. In 2022, obviously, there's the invasion. And again, the invasion happened days after Putin met not just with Ukrainian officials, but also with the West, telling them that they were crazy. Russia had no intention to actually invade, right? Even though NATO had all these satellite pictures saying, you have amassed huge armies right at the border. And Russia was like, oh, it's military exercises, right? It's military exercises. We're not actually doing this. And then even after the invasion, Russia has not, there haven't been many agreements since 2022, but one that they have reached an agreement on was a grain deal to allow Ukraine to continue to export grain through the Black Sea, with UN monitoring to make sure that this was actually just agricultural products that were being sent out. Russia agreed to this under a great deal of international pressure, including from a bunch of developing client states that rely heavily on grain exports to keep their food prices low. Ukraine is, prior to the war at least, represented about 10% of the global market for grain. And that deal did last a year, so it's doing better than either of the Minsk ceasefires. But in July 2023, Russia just unilaterally withdrew from that. With the argument that Ukraine was actually doing this was actually exporting and importing military equipment with this. But the UN was monitoring it, and the UN disagreed with that assessment. And instead, Russia was using it to boost their own grain exports. So perhaps Ukrainians can be forgiven for thinking that promises from Russia are not worth the paper they're printed on. And so, obviously this has become a big issue in recent weeks as pressure from the United States has increased for Ukraine to agree to different conditions. An analyst in Kiev, right, has argued that, Russia observes two kinds of agreements. One's backed by power, or one that's in Russia's interest, and Ukraine doesn't qualify for either of those on their own, which is why there is so much discussion from the Ukrainian side about the need for security guarantees, right? Not as a method of escalation, but as a method of deterrence, that Russia has no incentive to abide by an agreement that it makes unless there is some power backing it. The Wall Street Journal editorial board basically says another ceasefire, right, a Minsk III, would merely give Mr. Putin a respite to refinance his war machine after sanctions ease, rearm, and invade again later, right? And that's why territorial concessions are potentially problematic as well. Because if you recognize those territories as Russian, then Russia is free to build up as much military power, do as much, right, that they want to there. And then Ukraine has a worse starting point for future aggression. And they're unclear, right, minus the security guarantees, they're not clear if, when Russia attacks again, whether they will be able to get the same level of international assistance, which is why Zelensky is insisting that you can't reach the bargain and then talk about security guarantees later. Security guarantees are part of the bargain. There are things that Ukraine can agree to, and Ukrainian public opinion are in favor of in the presence of security guarantees that simply cannot be agreed to in the absence of security guarantees. And this was published yesterday, and this is a Gallup poll of Americans. And Ukrainians are not alone, right? 79% of American respondents thinks that Russia will violate an agreement. And 70% believe that in this bargain, any deal is going to favor Moscow. So Ukrainians are not alone in that. Now, Ukrainians are acutely aware that they are bargaining from a position of power, but they are hoping, right, that international backing will give them more power so that an agreement can be reached, including conditions that they can agree to. Because of the credible commitment problem, there are some conditions that they simply cannot agree to. And unfortunately, yesterday's call between Putin and Trump, the condition for peace that Putin is insisting on is that Ukraine has to stop rearming and receiving military aid and intelligence support, right? The Russian claim, the Russian account of this phone call includes this claim. The U.S., according to the BBC, the U.S. accounts of the phone call did not mention this. But that is obviously a credible commitment problem. You can't bargain over things that are going to make you weaker in the event that the other side decides to renege. Those are very difficult to do. And so this claim, and it's been a claim since 2022, right? This is something that Russia wants to see. They want to see Ukraine demilitarize. But if Ukraine demilitarizes, then the threat of future Russian aggression is worse, right? They have no defense against that, which is why they are leaning hard into the demands for international security guarantees. But if Russia is setting the baseline to start the negotiations as Ukraine has to be militarily weak and without international support, then it is not rational for Ukraine to agree to a bargain on those deals. On those terms. So the agreements that were reached supposedly in the Trump-Putin call yesterday was a pause on energy attacks. From the Russian side, it was supposed to start immediately. We have claims and counterclaims that did not happen, that even overnight that there were attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure by Russia. And Russia claims that Ukraine attacked an oil refinery in Krasnodar. Since this phone call. But they did agree to continue talking and to try and reach a military ceasefire in the Black Sea as well. The energy attack pause may still work out. We'll see. It's off to a rocky start in terms of the credible commitment problem. But Russia refused to agree to a full ceasefire. They refused to allow the Ukrainian troops that are still in the Kursk region, not very much of the Kursk region. They've been pushed back almost to the border, but Putin refused to allow them to retreat. And the other thing that we're not sure what's going on, but hasn't been agreed on, is that Russia is insisting that Ukraine is not party to these negotiations, which is a very difficult position to put Ukraine in. How is another country supposed to bargain on behalf of Ukraine? And short of joining the war on the side of Russia, the U.S. can't force Ukraine to accept certain conditions, right? That's not how this works. And so again, all of this is very is still an evolving story, but Ukrainian public opinion has moved in response to the war, and as the war has gotten longer, but there is not any kind of consensus that a bargain is necessarily a good deal for Ukraine, at least right now, and certainly not under the conditions that Russia claims they are willing to bargain with. So time for questions, I think.
Thanks, Celeste, very much for that very interesting, very rich presentation. So if you have a question, we'll go to the question and answer period now. Please raise your hands, wait for a microphone to come to you, and then when you do get the microphone, please stand, tell us your name, what you're studying, if you're a student, or if you have another position, tell us who you are, so Professor Beesley can get to know you a little bit, and then ask your question. And we know that as we get closer to the hour, some of you may need to leave for a 1 o'clock class, and that's fine, but we will go until 1 o'clock. So please, questions.
Hello, my name is Tayton Fuja. I'm an American Studies major. I wanted to know, what reason does Ukraine have to believe that security guarantees will work, given that in the Budapest Memorandum they had security guarantees and those haven't been the most effective?
So, I mean, that's a very interesting question, right? Because even in 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, there was significant discussion, especially in the US and the UK and among international legal scholars, about whether the Budapest Memorandum obligated the US and the UK to come to Ukraine's aid, since it had just had a big chunk of territory annexed. And it didn't go anywhere because, right, security issues, sort of the interests of the United States and the UK were not consistent with getting into an argument with Russia over Ukraine. And so why would they trust international security guarantees? I mean, that is one reason why they're really pushing for peacekeepers or for troops on the ground. That's one of the reasons why that's sort of Ukraine's preferred method of security guarantees, because that ties the country's hand, right? If they have put their own boots on the ground and then those soldiers are attacked and killed, then it changes sort of the calculus in terms of domestic politics, in terms of that country's international reputation, if they were not to respond to an attack on sort of UK troops or French troops, right? Those are the two countries that have sort of had the most serious discussions about whether they're willing to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. But I don't think that these security guarantees would be entirely empty. The United States is in an interesting position. It is less consistently and less sort of importantly committed to Ukrainian independence than Europe, because it's further away, right? And so the United States has lots of other foreign policy priorities, things like that. But for Europe, they have in the last 3 years defined sort of Ukrainian security as a measure of European security, right? Because in the speeches given just before the invasion of Ukraine, Putin made it very clear that he was not interested only in Ukraine, right? And so particularly for countries with a history of sort of occupation and interference from Russia, like Poland and the Baltics, who are NATO members, that those countries are very invested in Ukrainian security. And so the idea is that there is more sort of self-interest, at least by the European nations, tied up in Ukrainian security now, because Russia is seen as far more aggressive now, and less likely to sort of stop if they are not stopped. And so that, I think, is why Ukraine believes that security guarantees from European countries, at least, would be more like that Europe has more skin in the game, that they are less likely to think that what happens in Ukraine doesn't matter for them and for their security. So it's really a self-interest thing, a change in the assessment of self-interest. But that is why they specifically want boots on the ground.
Okay. My name is Brett. I'm an international relations student here. And I'm just curious kind of about the Russian perspective and Putin's perspective. Before I came here, I was at BYU, and we did a lot of talking with Dr. Mema about the individual level of analysis and this armada of reasons that Putin would have. Claims like these territories that he's seeking to occupy in Ukraine were previously owned by Russia but given to the Ukrainian territory before the split. I make no move to defend Russia. I'm just kind of curious on your analysis and your thoughts about those things.
So in looking at, for example, and trying to think about Russian public opinion, it's very difficult because Russia is, the government has a high level of information control over what Russian citizens see or perceive. They also exert a great deal of repression over Russian citizens. And so, especially since the beginning of the war, no one is allowed to criticize the war, criticize the government, right? I mean, even like teenagers drawing pictures in school have been subject to court cases for, I think the charge is defaming the military, right? So we don't know what Russian public opinion is on this. And even if we had sort of reliable polls, they would not necessarily be reliable because of the kind of skewed information or lack of information that we know Russian citizens actually receive. In terms of Putin has made a lot of claims. If you go back and watch the speech that he gave on President's Day in 2022, so like 2 or 3 days before the invasion, he was basically playing pretext for war bingo, right? I mean, seriously. He was like, they have nuclear weapons. There are Islamic terrorists. They're corrupt, right? I mean, he had like this whole list of reasons that other countries, notably the United States, right, have given for invading other countries. And he had all of them, right? And so, I mean, I think this idea that sort of like historically this territory belonged to us and so we get it back is an exceedingly difficult thing to deal with, especially if we're talking about Europe, right? I mean, if you think about European maps over the centuries, there is not a whole lot of land in Europe that doesn't have multiple claimants that held it at different points in time. And so, I mean, my argument would be Putin may think that. That may be a sincere belief. I'm not sure. But it is not something that the international community can really accept. Since 1945, the norm has been that we don't revise, right, that you don't use force to revise the map, regardless of those kind of claims, right, those kind of things. And that's something that, like, countries, when they were coming out from under colonialism in Africa, right, they said, we'll take the borders we've got. Like, they accepted that norm. And going back to a different norm where countries fight because they want that territory is exceedingly dangerous. And so support, which is one of the reasons why this war is seen as a security threat by Europe, by the West. Because going back to an international norm where powerful countries can revise the map based on their say-so and their interests is a recipe for a lot more conflict in the world. And so, yes, it is true. Crimea did not belong to Ukraine prior to the 1950s. Right, it depends. But there are a whole bunch of other, right, arguments that Putin made, none of which really hold much water, right? So he also argued that Ukraine was carrying out a genocide against Russian speakers in the eastern regions, and that was not, like, there was zero evidence of that. The only person who's been killing a bunch of Russian-speaking Ukrainians is Putin.
My name's Aaron Spute. I'm a freshman studying sociology. I was also just called to the Ukraine-Kyiv mission, and
So I understand you're going to Moldova?
yeah, that's
Okay.
correct. So my question is, for these, you noted all of the refugees leaving Ukraine, but for the millions staying in Ukraine, I'm curious: are they staying because of national pride, or they staying because they don't feel like there's as much of a threat? Are they just willing to live the risk of living in such a dangerous area? I'm just kind of curious what to anticipate for all these people staying in Ukraine right now.
So the reasons obviously are very individual. One thing I think that has kept a lot of people in Ukraine, even if they have left, right, the region that they live in and just gone to, say, Western Ukraine, where there are fewer attacks and there's relatively more security, So one factor that's at play is that prime age men, so between the ages of 18 and 60, are not allowed to leave Ukraine. And so there are a number of people who, in the interest of staying closer to family, right, because they don't want to dissolve a marriage, right, those kind of things, where the women and children have gone someplace safer but stayed in Ukraine so that it's easier to visit and stay with that. Now, there are a number of Ukrainian men who have left via various means, but I think that is one factor. Whereas if you are older, right, older Ukrainians, a lot of older Ukrainians actually have stayed in place, right? If you look at these cities that are under siege and being surrounded, where they're evacuating people, it's almost always, right, these 70-year-old people who are like, just kill me here because I can't, right? I have nothing if I leave here, right? I have this apartment, but I have nothing if I leave. And so to a certain extent, right, people who are younger have more of a prospect for a good life leaving, right? People with children, those kind of things. And I think that has been a big part in the reception of the Ukrainian refugees. Especially if we contrast that with, say, like the Syrian refugees from 2015, right? The Ukrainian refugees really were welcomed by many countries with open arms, and they certainly benefited from being, white European Christians. But it was also because the refugee flow was overwhelmingly women, children, and the elderly, right? As opposed to the Syrian refugee crisis, where you had a lot of young men coming in, and people just saw those as that category of refugees as being potentially more problematic, whereas, women, children, and the elderly, like, culturally were programmed to be altruistic toward those people, to think they need help, and that they should be provided help. So there's going to be a weird gender dynamic dealing with Ukraine. It's going to be nearly all women and old people. But why people stay is very individual. For some, it is patriotism. And for some, it's just, right, how do you leave home? How do you leave your country? How do you go to be a stranger in a strange land, especially when your country has so much suffering, right? There's a certain amount of solidarity there.
Hi, I'm Caleb Jenkins. I lived in Kharkiv before the conflict. I've heard you mentioned the Russian propaganda machine happening to influence Russian public opinion, and there have been claims that a similar thing is happening in Ukraine to influence Ukrainian public opinion. What would you say to claims of Ukrainian propaganda?
So countries use propaganda during, like, depending on how you define propaganda, right? Countries use propaganda during war, right? You can go Google, like, U.S. propaganda posters, UK propaganda posters from World War II. They're actually super fun. I talk about them in my abuse of power class. But first of all, the sort of propaganda and misinformation that's going on in Ukraine is at a lower rate. And second of all, there is a lot more freedom of information in Ukraine, right? So there are multiple media sources, international news. It penetrates Ukraine much more thoroughly, right? Russia has done a lot to try and limit what that is, right? So there is very little independent media in Ukraine, or in Russia, sorry. And there is quite a bit of control over what kind of international media and websites and things are allowed into Russia. Let's see if I go to my backup slides. Okay, so this is a study that was published in 2023 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And what they were looking at was biased specifically in the number of losses that were reported in Russia and in Ukraine. And so you can see, right, we've got this zero line here, and there's, a distribution. And basically, right, numbers greater than 1 indicate that sources from the country overestimate losses, and less than 1 indicate an underestimation. And so you can see here, right, when you give, like, Ukrainian estimates of Ukrainian losses, you can see here, right, this is 1 death, the number of tanks, the number of casualties. So you can see that Ukraine is underestimating its own casualties, and maybe slightly overestimating Russian casualties. But these are, they're using the colors to show sort of the deviation from the zero line in terms of like best estimates versus government reports. But you can see when you come up with to Russia here, right? This is 7.4, 4.3, right? There are huge exaggerations in Ukrainian losses and underreporting of Russian losses. And so, again, right, countries use spin, especially during war, because they are trying to keep sort of nationalism, patriotism, morale high. And that is something that we observe like in all wars in all countries. But every indication that we have is that the extent to which Ukrainians have information, have unbiased information, have contestation of different ideas in their information is much, much higher than what we observe in Russia.
All right, I'm Ashton Blake. I'm an IR major, and I was just wondering, I've heard several things about, like, wars they always underestimate how long they're going to be. Do you think when Putin invaded Ukraine that he thought it would take this long, or do you think that he legitimately thought that Ukraine would fall within a couple months?
We are pretty certain that Putin did not assume that the war would take this long or cost this much. Because, right, unlike the Ukrainians, Russia had the decision whether they were going to start the war or not, right? The war just sort of was not, there was no opt-out for Ukraine on this war. There was an opt-out for Russia, right? This is something that is commonly circulated in like Ukrainian social media, right? If Russia stops fighting, there is no war. If Ukraine stops fighting, there is no Ukraine. And so, yes, we assume that there was some information asymmetry. We know that polling data in Ukraine from before this, right, when they were asking people like grossly hypothetical questions about like, would you fight for your country's independence, that the numbers were not perhaps as high as actually ended up being the response to this. So he almost certainly underestimated Ukrainian resolve. Now, whether that was sort of a sincerely held belief or just like soldiers were told they were going to liberate Ukrainians and that they would be welcomed with open arms. Like we have that account from captured Russian soldiers. And so whether that was something that like the Kremlin sincerely believed is unclear. Certainly an underestimation of the West's reaction, I think, is a big part of it, that they did not think that the West would come to help Ukraine. And again, based on the fact that nobody showed up in 2014, despite the Budapest Memorandum, that there hasn't been, right, a super strong response in reaction to defending Ukraine. Whereas but a full-scale invasion really changed, again, European assessments of what this means for their own security. And so generally, we believe that Putin underestimated that. So both Ukrainian resolve and Western willingness to assist Ukraine. Because for a long time, right, Europe was like, it's really terrible that this has happened to you. Here's some humanitarian aid. You're not getting any lethal aid, right? I mean, that was the Obama administration's take on, right? There were years where this was the response from Europe. Whereas, and the United States, right? Whereas after the 2022 invasion, like even Germany was like, you want some tanks? Right? They were very, like, there was this huge shift in the perception of there being a Russian threat to Europe with the 2022 invasion. And I don't think Putin necessarily calculated that. We think that this might be an example of a problem that dictators have. See, when you have too much power and you've like sort of killed, disappeared, erased too many people for telling you things you didn't want to hear, people stop telling you things. And so you go with the information, and anything you say, people are like, that's a good idea. You should do that. So that might be part of the information asymmetry. Like the Russian military was not as forthcoming as they maybe could have been about their level of preparation, those kind of things. And there are some things that maybe he couldn't have known, like the Western willingness to assist. But yeah.
This kind of goes along with like the West's willingness to assist, but like obviously America doesn't isn't giving aid right now, but I know like
I think they've resumed aid.
they've resumed
It
aid,
was a temporary
or like
pause.
I know that a lot of like European countries like convened specifically to talk about like Europe's going to be the group that steps up and starts sending real aid. Do Ukrainians feel like pretty confident that like enough aid will come to like keep doing what they're doing? Do they feel like they're losing the aid slowly and don't have enough left?
So it depends, right? So aid sent to Ukraine, if you look at what the US has sent so far versus what Europe has sent so far, so the EU number is slightly below the US number, but if you include the UK and Norway and what's the other? Switzerland, right? The EU has given more aid than the United States. And I think, honestly, for Ukraine, the amount of aid does matter, and a loss of US aid would be problematic for Ukraine, but I think that what they would really like is more sort of the deterrent threat that US has their back, right? That the US is providing a security guarantee, because there is going to be a lag, right? Even if this is a dramatic shift and Europe is sort of producing more and investing more in their own militaries, there is going to be a gap in time before Europe can have sort of the same military capacity. And so the U.S. is important for that military capacity. Not, again, that Ukraine wants the U.S. to fight for it necessarily, but they want the security guarantee. They want Putin to have to worry that the U.S. is involved and that the U.S. has their back, right? Because everybody's playing this probability game. And they want the probability, right? This is deterrence. This is like the entire Cold War foreign policy, right? Is the idea that if you have enough force, you don't have to use it. And that is what Ukraine would like to do, right? That is the optimal strategy for you. This is what Ukrainians would like to see, right? An ability to end the fight, but not peace at any price. Peace that would be durable because Russia would have to actually abide by the commitments that it makes.
Okay, thank you. Join me. We're time yet. You get a chance to ask a question.